Welcome to our podcast, A Novel Talk, co-hosted by Carl Lee, and I'm Wendy Kendall. My new romantic mystery, Snow Kiss Cookies to Die For, is now available for pre-order with online retailers, recipe included. In this ebook, Desiree and Leo are tangled up in romance and mystery. She's a first grade teacher, and he's on the school's maintenance staff, and they're falling in love. But this holiday season, Desiree is being stalked. By who? There are several suspects, including Leo. So fun to write this story. And my mystery book, Cat Out of the Bag, that's cat with a K, is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, and all over. Catherine Watson, a purse designer and amateur sleuth, goes from designer bags to body bags when she's faced with a murder mystery. In the ebook prequel, Pistachio Makes a Splash, Catherine and Mayor Brenda Durling investigate a chilling cold case. Now I'm busy on the exciting sequel to Cat. Just wait until you see what she's facing this time. Thank you to all the readers who've let me know how much you enjoy my books. And here comes your co-host.
Thanks, Wendy. That cookie book sounds delicious. I can't wait to read it. Um, my name is Carl Lee, and I write paranormal fantasy. My first novel should be out, fingers crossed, sometime next year.
Thanks, Carl. Well, after a more than 35-year career as a nonprofit executive, today's guest now owns a freelance writing company called Lil Dog Communications. By the way, she's a big dog lover too. And she writes for nonprofits and businesses all over the world. With a master's degree in theater, she loves diving into a good story, whether she's writing it, reading it, watching it, or bringing it to the stage. She loves a mystery with the intriguing characters and danger lurking around every corner. Author of 3 series and 10 books, welcome to A Novel Talk with Lynn Bohart.
Hi, Wendy.
Hello, Lynn. Welcome.
Well, I'm just happy to be here. I love talking about writing and storytelling with not only writers but people who love to read. So I'm just thrilled to be here.
We're thrilled to have you too, Lynn, and thank you for joining us.
You bet.
I'm going to jump right in. In your novel, The Essence of Murder, one of the less obvious characters in the book is the setting. You make the setting literally a living, breathing entity in the book. The creek that winds down from what appears to be a dead-end canyon. How do you manage to lay out a scene so blatantly and then throw a new surprise literally right around the corner?
Well, Carl, I love working with the setting in a mystery because they create a backdrop, or they frame the setting, helps to frame the story.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading, ages ago now, a book that I can't recall the name of it, but it was a mystery set in Minnesota during an ice storm. And the crackling of the ice, the snapping of the branches, and frankly, the frigid cold that the detectives were working against enhanced the story so much that I've just always remembered that. So when I started writing, I felt like the setting really needed to make a difference in the story. And so I worked very hard at that. And in this particular book, well, I should say in the series, I've set them, the Giorgio Salvatore series, in my hometown of Sierra Madre in Southern California. And in the first 3 books, I've attempted to use recognizable landmarks, especially obviously for people who live down there. And I grew up next to a Catholic monastery. And so I used that in the first book called Mass Murder. In the second book, which is the one that Wendy read, called In Murder in the Past Tense, The Penny House, which is a big Victorian bed and breakfast now. It's a landmark in Sierra Madre, and that was the setting in that book. And so in Essence of Murder, I started thinking, okay, what's another, there's a couple other sort of physical landmarks in the area, but I remember actually hiking up in Bailey Canyon when I was young. And so I decided to set the crime in Bailey Canyon. Um, and I did play with a few particulars about the canyon itself, but your question is interesting to me because in this book, the story begins when a young woman's body is found in the stream, and she has two holes in her neck. Da-da-dum. And it's not apparent from the beginning how she died because the two holes in her neck wouldn't have killed her. But the ME immediately notices dirt under her fingernails and her ears, and he announces to the detectives that the woman's been buried and then dug up. So, obviously that's surprise number one, which requires further investigation by them. In addition to that, she's only wearing like a light cotton sheath. She doesn't have undergarments on or shoes. And so they're wondering, wait a minute, where did this woman come from? And why is she in a canyon dressed like that at night? And there are no bruises or cuts or anything on the bottom of her feet. So the setting here plays in contrast in that situation to how they find her. And now they need to look for her grave. So I started from that initial place in the creek bed where her body is found, and when I came up with the idea that, wait a minute, she's been dug up and moved to this location, then they need to go find her grave. So they begin looking for that, and they find a glen further up the canyon that includes like a seating area made out of logs, a fire pit, and what looks like an altar. And that's kind of surprise number two. It's like, what is this doing here? Because this isn't an area where anybody's allowed to camp. And then surprise number three comes when Giorgio is in that area alone with his basset hound Grosvenor, which is the canine star of the book. And the dog is suddenly attacked by a mountain lion. And I right now, even I belong to a Facebook group with people in Sierra Madre. And when I grew up down there, you never saw, wildlife in town. And I'm constantly getting posts from my people that I know now in Sierra Madre of mountain lions and bears that are coming down from the hillsides, because Sierra Madre is nestled in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains,
Mm-hmm.
and these big animals are coming down into town. So I use the idea that so close to the city there's a mountain lion, and he attacks the dog, and then out of nowhere comes the pit bull Shadow that saves him. So that's kind of surprise number three. But then the canyon's not done yet serving up surprises and secrets, because Giorgio and his brother, Giorgio realizes, wait a minute, if there's a group of vampires meeting up here all the time, how do they get here? They're not hiking up the canyon. So they start looking for a path. And sure enough, they find a path that goes up beyond that glen to a parking lot. And then sure enough, they find something else that's a surprise. And that's the remnants of an old dogfighting ring, and several dogs buried near there, obviously dogs that didn't make it out of the dogfighting ring. And then suddenly the story takes a turn, because we're not just looking at the death of this young woman, but people who are playing at being vampires and illegal dogfighting, which then, as you know, Carl, turn out later to have to do with drug running. So all of that stems from just the basic setting of Bailey Canyon. And as a writer, I guess I'm just always looking for the next way to weave the setting into the story, and in an interesting and revealing way. I hope that all makes sense.
It does, and you do an excellent job of just showing us little nuggets along the way. It took an entire book for you to do what you just described in a few minutes. It was amazing. You mentioned your character, Detective Giorgio Salvatore. And I'm just going to ask you outright: is he psychic? He seems psychic.
Well, I'm not even sure I've answered that question for myself yet. He as a character, he doesn't like to think of himself as being psychic. But throughout his entire life, he's gotten what he calls hunches that, over time he's learned to listen to and then act on. And in fact, in this book, Flame, the character Flame, who is psychic, because she was actually in the last two books. She says to him, and I'm going to quote from the book now. She says, "You're a sensitive whether you know it or not. You should develop that skill." And he says to her, "I don't think so. It's enough just being a cop." So that whole balancing act that he has to do between he's sort of living on the edge of this paranormal universe and the black and white universe of being a police detective. But his brother Rocky often in all three books teases him about his hunches because he hears it. He hears Giorgio say that all the time. Like, I've just got a hunch. I think we ought to do this, and he's usually right. So he's always also been good at solving puzzles. In fact, I think in this book I even mentioned that his mom got tired of buying him puzzles because he was so good at them.
I love that.
Yeah. And I think he just has this sense of he's able to glimpse the next move. So because Flame obviously is a psychic, and I have a psychic in my other series too, and where they get visions and stuff. He doesn't get visions. He doesn't necessarily see things, but he gets these hunches and he acts on them. He doesn't know what to call them, I suppose. So I don't know. I guess I just enjoy about his characters is balancing that skepticism he has about ghosts and psychics against the fact that he actually relies on them in his murder investigations. And that puts him as a cop into conflict over and over again, because he can't really tell the other police officers that that's what he's doing. It's like he's got to maintain his credibility. So it is kind of an odd balancing act.
Well, you keep that balance because it's delightful.
Good.
You mentioned Flame and you mentioned Rocky, and you mentioned the fact that they all have a past. Now, she said something when Giorgio and Rocky first went to talk to her in this book, that kind of led me to believe that Giorgio and Flame may not always see eye to eye. What's the deal with their past?
Yeah, she's a really interesting character, and once I had her in Murder in the Past Tense, I decided I had to bring her in. I had to find a reason to bring her into this book. So in the book where she initially shows up, she's introduced when Giorgio goes to her. He has seen the ghost boy Christian Maynard up at the monastery. The first book has to do with a giant monastery, and he's concerned about it. He doesn't understand it, but he gets through that investigation, and then all of a sudden the boy turns up in the second investigation, and so he goes to Flame to kind of find out what's going on. And the boy has led him to the Penny House, which I mentioned earlier, and when he was there, he saw ghostly images of several women who had been mutilated and buried there. Very, really disturbing images. And so part of what he wants Flame to do is see if she can explain it. And even though he's never met her before, but he's really suspicious of her, partly because of her age, because she's young and she has piercings and tattoos everywhere. So she doesn't look like what you would, think of the typical, psychic with the glass ball and everything. But she immediately mentions that the boy is with him. And because he's seen the boy so many times, that's the credibility he needed. And so he starts to trust her. But what happens is that in that initial meeting, she goes into a trance and she allows the boy to take her back to the Penny House, and she sees what he saw the night before. And she's horrified by it because it's gruesome. It's just awful. And she wants to stop at that point, and he convinces her that he needs her help. And so she does play a critical role in Murder in the Past Tense, especially in the ending, because that book, talk about settings, they end up chasing the murderer into an abandoned sanatorium, which really existed at one time. I researched it and saw a picture of it and everything, and then tried to describe that accurately. And she's you can imagine that in an old sanatorium, there's lots of um, restless souls floating around, and she's able to communicate with them. So she's instrumental in the investigation and murder in the past tense. So he comes back to her in this book. That's what, it's not that she doesn't like him and Rocky. It's she's nervous, I think, that she doesn't want to be drawn into something that horrendous again. And so I think that there's just a real hesitancy. And as you know, because you read this book, the ending is just the ending of this book is disturbing, and her role in the ending of this book is kind of disturbing. So even though she agrees to do it, in this book, it actually puts her physically at risk. And so now I'm faced with the question of whether or not she's going to show up in the next book. But as you also know, I've started this flirtation between her and Rocky, which many of my readers really like. So, I suppose she's going to have to make another appearance.
Yes, I also am one of those mini readers. I liked the almost three-way relationship that Rocky and Giorgio and Flame had.
Yeah.
So you talk about Shadow, and you talk about the mountain lion attack, and I know that I knew when I read that Shadow was more than just a convenient rescue. But what is so uniquely special about her, and how was she able to unite, join with the Salvatore family so quickly and so completely that it just was heartwarming?
Yeah, you kind of fell in love with her, didn't you?
I totally did.
Yeah. So let me tell you the background, because first of all my novels have dogs as main characters. I decided early on that would be a foundational thing in my books because I love them so much. I even, for many, many years, have acted as a foster to rescue dogs. So I work very hard at creating dogs that are realistic and true to nature. They're not meant to be cartoonish in any way. And I want my readers to fall in love with them and relate to them. So in my first standalone book, Grave Doubts, the dog's a German Shepherd. In the Old Maids of Mercer Island mystery series, it's 2 miniature dachshunds that are based on my 2 miniature dachshunds. And then in this book, it's Grosvenor, who's a basset hound. And when I first wrote this book, that name comes from, I used to run a hospital foundation down in Oregon, and my assistant, I was looking around for names, and she said, "Oh, I used to have a basset hound named Grosvenor." And I went, "How weird. What a weird name. That would be perfect." So he rescues Grosvenor from a shelter. So he's a rescue. And obviously he gets gravely injured in this book, and it's the pit bull who saves him. Excuse me. So I wanted to expound on the ghost, Christian Maynard, in this book, and I decided to do it with another dog. And so I put Grosvenor in danger, and I had him attacked by the mountain lion, and the pit bull comes out of nowhere to save him. And then obviously Shadow becomes an important player in the story. And I based Shadow on a video that I watched many, many years ago by a rescue organization in Los Angeles that's called Hope for Paws. And they often post videos of them actually going out in the streets of Los Angeles and saving dogs. And there was one about a gray pit bull, and I just always remembered it. In fact, when I was writing the book, I went and I looked it up on YouTube and found that video again. Because I've always been deathly afraid of pit bulls, partly just because of their reputation, and partly because one of my brother's dogs was killed by a pit bull once. Mm-hmm. And this video of this gray dog just entirely changed my opinion of them. She had been abused, and she'd been out abandoned on the streets forever. She was frightened and meek and mild. And when they rescued her, they just turned her life around, and she got adopted by a forever home and has a wonderful life. And so I decided to use her as the dog in this series or in this book. And so to your question, I wanted readers to leave with a question in their mind as to whether shadow was real or not. Because I'm not even sure I've decided that. Because in some ways I mean, she was real enough to scare off a mountain lion. She's real enough to touch and feel, and she comes to the rescue in the end. But because of her relationship with Christian, the ghost boy, he clearly seems to know her, or knows about her, or she's I mean, even Giorgio thinks she's meant to play a role in this somehow, but he doesn't know how. And then, of course, she does in the end. And then I won't spoil the ending, because I'm clearly, I knew I was taking a chance, because people would fall in love with her. But um, the last scene in the book that you will know is, I think, so powerful because of the connection to Christian, the young boy, and it raises a question in your mind as to whether she's even real or not.
Yes, it
So
did.
I probably didn't answer your question, but
No,
that's
you did. You
okay.
did. You totally did.
Okay. But I think that's
I
part of what's fun about reading books sometimes, is that you bring your own attitudes, your own belief system, your own interpretations to the book, and you leave with that, and yours could be different than mine.
Yeah, I wondered throughout the whole book whether or not Shadow was real or not, and right up to the very end, I still wondered.
Did you
Um,
have a tear in your eye at the end?
I'm a boy. We don't. Yes.
The truth comes out.
it was very dramatic. It was
Yeah,
very
good.
impactful. So you mentioned the vampire culture that's woven through the mystery. Um, what specifically drew you to this uh, community?
Well, what's funny is that I've never been a big fan of vampire stories. So it's kind of weird that I wrote one. Um, but the obviously the victim, in essence, of murder, which is this young woman named Lindsay Nagel. She's based on a woman I actually knew. She was a woman who took one of my writing classes. And when I told the class that they would be doing writing exercise and then reading their work back to the class for feedback, she got really nervous, and she told the class about her list of phobias and how she was working to overcome them. And she even mentioned that she had tried rock climbing, and she had become to love it so much she became an instructor. And if you'll remember, Lindsay Nagel thinks that in the very first opening
Hmm.
chapter. So I based her character on this woman that I knew, and I thought the epitome for someone who hates crowds, is scared to death of intimacy and needles, would be to join a vampire group. And yeah, I mean, wouldn't it? And so and I have to admit, I fell back on, quite a while ago. I was looking through websites and found a vampire website, that actually had a questionnaire on it that you could take to determine whether or not you're a vampire. And that just fascinated me. And of course, I put it in the book, and the young cop McCready, takes the test, takes the quiz. But I realized when I saw that there's an entire subculture of people out there who dabbled in being vampires. And when I started writing the book, then I did more research, and sure enough, there's multiple types of vampire groups. And then I have Flame, outline those to the cops. She's done her research, and she comes back and she tells them about it. And I just felt for Lindsay Nagel, the contrast between who she was, this person who'd lived her entire life almost shut away because of all her many phobias, and who the vampire group would complicate things in a way that would make a really interesting investigation. So that's why I did it.
Yeah,
And you
it
know
it
what?
was a
I should
great.
mention, because we keep talking about Essence of Murder, that for I think you're going to post this tonight, that for readers through tomorrow, I have Essence of the Kindle version of Essence of Murder up on Amazon for free through tomorrow, Thursday, the 21st.
Wow.
Awesome. Excellent.
Yeah, they can
Yes.
get it for free.
Yes. You heard it here first, so that highly
Yeah.
recommended. Well, Lynn, Murder in the Past Tense is your fourth full-length novel and sequel to Mass Murder as part of the Giorgio Salvatore mystery series. Giorgio is a veteran New York police officer who moved to Southern California suburbs. Would you talk a little about this complex and compassionate man?
Sure. I mean, first of all, don't you love the title, Murder in the Past Tense? I just think that's a
Yes.
great, I've always thought that was a great title. Every once in a while, we writers have these little bursts of creativity that we just fall in love with.
Yes, it
Um,
draws the reader right to
yeah.
it. Yeah, you just want to open that cover.
Well, and it is, it's a 40-year-old murder mystery. And back to your question, they say write what you know. So when I first got the idea to write Mass Murder, which is the first book in the series, I decided to create the character of Giorgio Salvatore based on a friend of mine who I had done a bunch of community theater with up in Wenatchee, Washington. And when I met Mike and started doing theater with him, he wasn't just an apartment manager. And eventually, he was accepted into the police academy and he became a cop. And when he joined the force, of course, his schedule wasn't his own anymore, and he had to stop doing theater until he became a detective. And then he started doing plays with me again. I was directing and casting him in plays. And because he had this rotating schedule, as he could do certain productions every year. Anyway, Mike was actually a really good actor, and he told me once that he felt the physical need to be on stage, and he'd thought of going professional, but he just never did. And I loved the idea of a detective who also loved acting on stage. So when I write about Giorgio, I picture Mike. I wrote about his whole family is Giorgio's family, and I just picture them in my mind. I knew them really well. I hear his voice. I see how he moves, and he is Giorgio.
That's
And I know
beautiful.
it's interesting. It's interesting. It's really funny. He read the first book, Mass Murder, when it came out. And he was still a cop back then. And he emailed me and he said, Lynn, things don't really work that way. We typically know who the bad guy is beforehand or something like that. So he was kind of saying we don't go into these big investigations, which I thought was kind of baloney. But excuse me, I just had to take a drink. So anyway, one of the key things Mike told me back then, and this has always stuck with me, is that once he became a police officer, he didn't have that physical need to be on stage anymore. And I thought that was really interesting because, being a theater person, the whole deal about theater is the adrenaline rush of whether you're an actor or director or backstage or anything. There's just this adrenaline that goes with every single production, every night of the production. And once he became a police officer, he didn't feel that need to be on stage anymore. So I took his character and then I instilled him with this fierce love of his family. Excuse me, a real stubborn streak. Giorgio is very stubborn and he has a need to be in control, but he also has this ability to sort of sift through complicated situations that other people can't. And again, in Mass Murder, I complicated the story when his wife tells him she's pregnant with their third child. And he becomes completely unraveled by that because they already have two children and they were going to stop there. And the tension rises between he and his wife throughout the investigation. And that's how he gets Grosvenor, is that he says he's trying to appease his wife, and he goes to the shelter and he comes home with this basset hound when it's really he wants the dog. He's not his wife. She just thinks it's one more slob to clean up after. But the whole idea of her becoming pregnant created this wonderful subplot that then really unravels even further when she loses the baby. And obviously, and he realizes that now that the baby's gone, he really wanted it. So I just try to bring that forward through the books, all of that's those kind of deeper parts of his character. And then obviously he has a very strong relationship with his brother Rocky, who is also a cop,
Yes.
in the same police force. And I love working with their relationship, because Rocky is sort of ADHD, and in the first book, he suffers from alcoholism and he has to go into rehab. And but Giorgio dotes on him, and Giorgio kind of looks out for him and tries to take care of him. And yet they're very different. Rocky's this tall, really good looking, kind of cavalier, casual guy, where Giorgio's is this much more small, compact, intense personality. And again, I just have fun playing them off of each other. But I think in the end, I try to make Giorgio likable, but sometimes an irritating character, that frankly behaves like a lot of the men I've known in my life. Sorry to say that, but
Hey,
yeah. So sorry, Carl. Sorry.
So you're going for a lot of realism. I can see that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, the way that you use setting in Murder in the Past Tense is brilliant. And I know you and Carl talked about setting a little bit already, but it just it begs for more. Because the way you use setting, it permeates the story in such a compelling, it's just compelling ways. One thing that I have in common with my protagonist, Catherine Watson, is that I am also a transplant from Los Angeles to Seattle. So I know the Southern California setting, and you show it very well. And I'm just so impressed with how you've done it justice. When writing a mystery, how important to the story is setting, and how do you bring it to life? Can you give us a hint?
Well, I'm one of those people who, again, who really believes, I key in on setting when I'm either reading a book or watching a movie or TV, because I think the setting helps to frame the story, especially a murder mystery. And it's not that you have to have it be such a key player in the mystery, but to me, it enhances everything. And that was especially true in the first book in this series called Mass Murder, because I grew up next to this huge Catholic monastery that sits at the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, and I use that as the location where this woman gets murdered. And when I started that book, I purposely wanted the monastery to be like another character in the book. And so to do that, I added secret tunnels and hidden doorways just to complicate the investigation. And then, frankly, Giorgio treats the monastery itself almost like it's a suspect in the story. I mean, he knows there's something about the building, that there's a secret there that the building just won't give up. And it's almost like he begins to fight against the building, if you know what I mean, trying to get it to release its secrets. So when I came to Murder in the Past Tense, I used this very well-known landmark that I mentioned in Sierra Madre, the Penny House. In fact, Bob Hope made a movie called The Seven Little Foys there, when I was in
Oh.
grade school, and so it's had many owners. A friend of mine, her family actually lived in it. It is reputed to be haunted, and I contacted the current owners and asked them how they'd feel if I used it, and they said great. They even told me about a current. They had seen the ghost of a little girl on the back staircase that I mentioned in the book. And so I wanted to use the Penny House as sort of the central location for Murder in the Past Tense. It's obviously where the bodies are buried, and it's where most of the key players lived at one time. And you know as a writer, Wendy, how difficult it's sometimes to describe the setting so that your readers can put themselves there, and that's what I try to do. I think my theater background helps, because I tend to see everything like it's a play or a movie. I visualize every scene, and then I attempt to bring that forward through not just the visual descriptions, but sensory descriptions, as such as smell, taste and feel. And to be honest, if you've read it, one of my favorite Stephen King books, Salem's Lot, I read that back in college. I never forgot that. I marveled at how I could almost smell the decay of death in those caskets. And so that has always stuck with me. And so that's what I work with a lot, to try to bring um, to bring the setting of the environment to life, so that the reader not just pictures it in their minds, but feels almost like they're in it. If that makes sense.
Yes, as you're describing how you do it, I little scenes are just popping into my head too from the story. Yes, and like you said, using all the different senses. There's also a paranormal element in Murder in the Past Tense. Would you talk a little more about the boy?
The boy. So, some of my readers now love Christian Maynard, and when they read the next book,
Present.
it's like they can hardly wait until he shows up. So I decided in that first book, Mass Murder, that I wanted it to be paranormal. I just love ghosts. I just always have. But I didn't want some kind of creepy crawly thing to kill people. None of my ghosts are like that. I wanted something that would scare Giorgio in the beginning, but in the end, he would learn to not just rely on it, but maybe even grow to care about the boy, which he does. And when he first learns who this boy was, because the boy actually killed, he grew up, or he didn't grow up. He was going to the school. There was a boys' school as part of the monastery, and some of the boys were being abused by some of the priests. And he ended up murdering the abbot, and then he hung himself. He threw himself out a window and hung himself, and that's how Christian died. And so when he first makes himself known to Giorgio in that book, it scares the heck out of him. He doesn't understand what's going on. He's very skeptical. But by the end of the book, he's learning to trust Christian. And at the end of Mass Murder, he goes to the Catholic diocese, and he gets them to tear down the Mass Murder. The whole thing has to do with the tower, the bell tower at the monastery, and he gets them to tear it down. And he thinks that's going to release Christian, and Christian won't have to live here on earth anymore. He can go to heaven. So he's really surprised when he shows up in the next book.
That's right.
Yeah, it's like, whoa, what happened here? So I've tried to develop him in such a way that he never talks. He doesn't write things. I have ghosts in my cozy mystery series where the lead character's mother calls her on a cell phone, and she's been dead for a couple of years. And so that there, the boundaries between this world and the next world, I have really erased those boundaries.
Yes.
Yeah, but not so much in this series. So he functions more like what you would think of as a traditional ghost, in that he can't speak. He's hard to see, but he does in each one of the books, he does hand something over to something physical to Giorgio. And in this book, in Murder in the Past Tense, he throws a coin. Giorgio sees him across the street through the kitchen window, and suddenly Christian throws something, and it lands on the floor in Giorgio's kitchen. And it's a coin from Big Bear, and there's a very specific clue where Giorgio ends up in Big Bear. So I've and I know my writers group like to challenge me on, well, wait a minute, what are your parameters? What are the rules of your ghosting? And it's like, well, I don't know what the rules of being a ghost are. I think you have to create something that the reader will buy into and care about. At least that's what I'm trying to do. And so far, I think I've been successful. Nobody's ever criticized me on the paranormal aspects of my books. And in fact, with the Cozy Mystery series, they love the ghosts. And I've had several of my beta readers, when they've read like Murder in the Past Tense and then Essence of Murder, they've told me later they were just waiting for Christian to show up again. So yeah, so I hope that answered your question, Wendy.
Yeah, it does, and I agree. Even I mean, with Giorgio, getting to know and getting to care about the boy, the reader goes through that same journey with him. And at least this reader, I really did get to a point where I was really caring about the boy.
Hmm.
So it was
Hmm.
interesting. Now,
Well, and I didn't mention that, you know this and Carl knows this, that the boy, his father was a police officer. And because Giorgio asks Flame at one point, why does he show up to me? Why is he attached himself to me? And she says, because his father was a police officer. And so that's sort of the bonding there, that like right away in Mass Murder, the first book, Christian recognizes that there's been a murder, and here are all these police officers, and he connects with Giorgio. And now they're bonded.
mm-hmm,
He doesn't show up
yes.
just willy-nilly. He shows up when there's an investigation, but that's the reason.
Yes, yes, it's almost that becomes a mystery that gets unraveled too as
Hmm.
you go through
Hmm.
it. Now, in my prequel, Pistachio Makes a Splash, the mystery is about solving a cold case. And you are also confronted with a cold case in your police procedural mystery, Murder in the Past Tense. Would you talk a little about ways you help a reader relate to a victim who was killed many years ago when it seems that society has forgotten?
Yeah, this. So the reason I wrote this book, and it was a cold case, is because it's related to the high school I graduated from, Pasadena High in Pasadena, California. And I set the murder on prom night in the year that I graduated, 1967. And so you can do the math and you can pretty much figure out how old I am. Um, and it was really fun to bring in some of the elements that I experienced back then, such as the newness of the Civil Rights Act and how people were still racially oriented. I mean, even back then, if you could be friends with black kids, but the idea of dating one was still very sacrilegious. And obviously in this book, the mother of Lisa was physically abused by her husband, but she never talks. She didn't tell anybody, and that was true back then for me. That if there was any kind of abuse going on behind closed doors, nobody knew about it. You that's something you dealt with. There was no Me Too movement, back then. So part of what I enjoyed about doing this cold case was taking it back to a time period that I was familiar with and bringing those elements in. And that's part of what helped develop the I want to say the main character, but because Lisa is the one that died. She's the murder victim, and so we get to know her through some of that because it was her mother became an alcoholic because of all of that, and she was in an alcoholic stupor the night that Lisa gets murdered. And so Lisa Farmer's the victim that she's discovered at the bottom of an abandoned well. And she's a blank slate to the detectives in the beginning. So we begin to get to know her when an older detective, Cal Birmingham, he shows up. He recognizes something in the newspaper that they found with her in the bottom of the well, and he knows who it is. He knows it's Lisa Farmer because he's the one that investigated it 40 years ago, even though he never found her body. And he really connected her. You can feel a sense of caring and fondness for her, even though he never even knew her. But he got to know her so well when he was trying to find her 40 years ago. So we get that feeling right away about her, and that she was a nice girl and she had a boyfriend and she was turning her life around and blah 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 blah. And then obviously that starts this whole investigation. Now the current detectives know who she is, they know who her mother is, they know who the boyfriend was, they know who went to jail for her murder, and they start interviewing people. And through those interviews, we get a picture of her. We start to know her, and not just feel sorry for her, but we had this feeling of this life lost. Here's this young, beautiful girl who died on her prom night, and she was rising above her situation. She had an alcoholic, divorced mother, which was not known that was not common back then. And she went out with a boy that she loved on prom night, and then she found herself literally in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she lost her life because of it. And then she's buried in a way that no one would have ever known what happened to her.
Yes.
And yeah, I know, and that's sad. That whole concept is sad, and I think you get a feeling throughout the book that she was trapped there for all eternity, and she, nobody was ever going to know anything more about her until her body is discovered, or her bones are discovered. And so then in the last scene, as you'll remember, Wendy, at the burial, I purposely tried to build a feeling about Lisa in a way that she'd been set free.
Beautiful.
That people remembered her now, and honored her, and I don't know why that was important to me. And so, a little side note, that when you look at the cover of that book, first of all, I'm on the cover. My high school graduation picture is there,
Oh, fun.
along with high school graduation pictures of several of my friends from that high school. And so we're supposed to represent the young women, because this is a serial killer over decades, that killed these young women. And so those photos on the front represent the women that were killed.
Oh, that is so fun. Thank you for the trivia.
Yeah.
Yes, everybody look at your YouTube right now because the cover's on there. That's very cool.
We could have a contest. Which one is me?
Yes. Well, a very prestigious Pasadena family is impacted by Lisa Farmer's murder. Giorgio is not intimidated by their influence and also does not jump to any conclusions. He follows the clues and the leads as they are uncovered. Can you talk a little about the art of planting clues for your characters and for the readers?
Yes, but first I have to say, because your question is so interesting when you say that he wasn't intimidated by their influence, this prominent family. One of my favorite characters in the book is the Ice Queen. You know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
To me, she is just wonderful. This is the boyfriend's mother, who I just had a ball creating her character. She's everybody. She's like the Glenn Close character in 101 Dalmatians. That's Cruella DeVille.
Yes.
It's kind of her. Anyway, so talk about plotting clues. Well, again, Wendy, as a mystery writer, that the whole point of plotting clues is to hide the killer, until you, the writer, want them to be revealed. And it's a fairly complicated process, although I'm going to kind of turn that on its head, because I'm a pantser.
Mm-hmm.
And for any of your listeners who don't know what that means, is that I don't plot my books in advance. And so there's pantsters and there's plotters. Are you a plotter?
I am a hybrid.
Oh, okay. Well, I typically know how the book will end, and I know how the book will begin, and I know the basic construct of why the murder takes place. But then I start writing, and I'm one of those people. I let the characters tell me how the plot's going to develop. Sometimes that actually is a problem, and I write myself into a corner. But I do some careful plotting of clues, like obviously what I call the clincher clue at the climax. I really take care with, but a lot of them, they just come to me. It's more instinct than anything.
Neat.
And they literally pop into my head. I don't know why. I've had people tell me that I have a weird brain. So
the writing process is really, it's magical, and it's very personal.
It is. Well, and you get to you write a series, you get to know your characters in a way that I miss them. I write two different series.
Yes.
So when I'm not writing the Giorgio Salvatore, I'm writing the Old Maids of Mercer Island, and when I'm done with that book, I'm missing Giorgio and Rocky, and I want to go back and see what they're doing.
Yes.
It's like they're real people. But anyway, the clincher clue is one that because I want that to be an aha moment. So I want the reveal of that clue to be very unexpected. Um, and at the end of the book, I'll go back through each chapter. I will what I call map each chapter, and what important information is revealed in that chapter and what clues are revealed. And that does give me an opportunity that if I think I need to move a clue around or add something, I will. And I don't know if you're familiar with Save the Cat beat sheet.
Yes. Yep.
So again, for your readers or your listeners, it was originally written for screenplay writers, and then Jessica Brody adapted it for novels. It's called Save the Cat, and it outlines the 15 plot points or beats that every novel should have. And I have to admit that probably if you're writing a mystery, I suppose it'd be a good idea to reveal your clues kind of along the 15 beats. I just don't. I mean, if I went back and mapped every beat in the book, my guess is they'd be pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to, as I said, I just sort of do it more through instinct. But clues have to be dribbled out little by little, and obviously in many mysteries, there's a lot of different ways to obscure things and to trick your readers. I just said this the other night to somebody that, writers, we manipulate readers all the time. That's what we do. And I know it sounds horrible, but it's what we do. So in some mysteries, the killer might be camouflaged. Perhaps they're camouflaged by their role in the story. They're a fellow cop, they're a family member, or a best friend. So you don't know who they are. You can further obscure things by distracting your reader. In other words, you reveal something and then you manage that information in such a way that your reader can't focus fully on it. Or you may purposely misdirect the reader. And this is similar, but what you're doing here is you're actually forcing your reader's attention away from the clue. So
Mm-hmm.
you drop something right in front of your reader, and then you drop something else that's more immediate and more important, and you move the reader off to that. And what they do is they know that clue was there, and they'll remember it later, but they don't focus on it now. And then you could obviously also employ things like red herrings, which everybody knows they appear to be real clues, but they're not. But your characters follow them for a while, at least, thinking that they're real clues. So that's a lot of how, when you're plotting clues in, you're also plotting these things in that will obscure things. Because frankly, if you just did clue after clue after clue after clue, it would be that bread trail or the trail of crumbs that would be too easy to follow,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, that's a
So
good point.
yeah, so you may plot the clues, but then you've got to plot everything that obscures the clues. So I want to give you a quick example in Murder in the Past Tense, and you'll remember this, that in the very short opening, it's almost like a prologue. Two dark figures dump the body of a young woman, who's Lisa, into an abandoned well. And then once their secret's safe, these two figures climb into a long black car and they glide silently away. So if you're paying attention as a reader, you know the killers were in a long black car. So then later, when Giorgio's interviewing Lisa's mother, she says, and this is from the book, she says, "Yes, I told the police that I heard a car around midnight. We lived on a dead end street, so cars didn't come up there very often. You didn't come onto our street unless you were coming to see someone. I thought that maybe it was Lisa coming back from the prom. But when I looked out the window, it was a big dark car, and then it was gone. And I heard a dog barking, but then I passed out." And, she was a drunk, and so she was an unreliable witness. But the car is mentioned, right? So Giorgio picks up on that.
Yep.
And then when they interviewed Jimmy Finn, who was arrested for her murder, he had lived next door to her. He was a year younger than her. And he tells Giorgio there was a car behind the house. And he asks, could that be Ron Martinelli's car dropping Lisa off after the prom? And Jimmy says, no, this car was parked. Ron always dropped Lisa off at the street, and she would walk down the alley. I used to wait and watch her come in the back gate. Ron never drove down the alley. And then Giorgio asked, could you tell what color it was? And he says, dark, black, maybe. So there's like this, it's like a reoccurring clue.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously that car plays a big role at the end when we as readers find out which direction that car was going on the street. Then that's what tells Giorgio who the murderer was. So that's just an example of how you don't necessarily all just say, well, here's clue number one, here's clue number two. Here's a clue that I give right up front. It's in the first couple of paragraphs of the book, but then I refer to it 2, 3, 4 times until finally it's, aha, that's it.
Yeah, that's a great example. Great example.
Speaking of great examples, Lynn, I was wondering, would you be willing to read an excerpt from one of your books, maybe Essence of Murder, for our listeners?
I would, if you will bear with me. You'll learn a lot about this young woman who's what they call polyphobic. I didn't know what that word meant until I wrote this book. So here is the chapter 1 to the Essence of Murder. She had read once that Xanax was the brake pedal needed to slow a speeding car fueled by anxiety. The drug was that good, and God knows she needed it. After all, her anxieties had sabotaged her life at every turn. The large dose she had taken of Xanax just an hour earlier had begun to work like a tranquilizer on her neurotransmitters, neutralizing the fears that threatened to turn the upcoming ceremony into a disaster. But there was something else. She could feel it. Another something pulsed through her veins. It was a different feeling altogether and left her with a mind-bending sense of euphoria. In fact, it was a different drug. She knew it. Coupled with the Xanax, her claustrophobic anxieties were not just being numbed, they were being stripped away one by one. But where had this other drug come from, and what was it? She lay on what the group referred to as the altar, bare except for a light cotton sheath covering her naked body. When someone came close and touched her skin, she flinched, despite the drugs, sparking a fear that registered somewhere deep within her brain. It was her fear of needles. She knew this ceremony included being pierced by the essence device. It was the main reason she had taken the Xanax. Now, memory surfaced of epic struggles at the doctor's or dentist's office when she was young. In those days, she would be reduced to episodes of primeval crying, screaming, and lashing out. Once, when a dental assistant had attempted to inject her with Novocaine, she jerked, and her arm slammed into the poor woman's nose, nearly breaking it. Now, as her ears sought out the muffled voices of the people nearby, she contemplated the biofeedback class her sister had suggested the year before. She'd gone to it reluctantly, but it had done wonders, giving her the courage to take control of her life. She had conquered her fear of heights by forcing herself to learn rock climbing. She'd even grown to like it. To overcome her dread of public speaking, she joined Toastmasters and found that once she got past the fact she was facing a room full of people, she was good at waxing poetic on random topics. And then a week ago, a friend had encouraged her to join the Essence of Life Society. It's a group of people who practice vampirism, her friend had whispered conspiratorially over lunch. It's very exciting. She had scoffed at the idea. No respectable person would join a group like that. But her friend wasn't eccentric. She had held down a perfectly normal job and even went to church on Sundays. And her friend named other professional people who belonged to the group, a teacher, a marketing consultant, even a lawyer. Upon further reflection, the idea had begun to intrigue her, even titillate her. She wanted to know more, especially when her friend showed her a picture of the leader of the group, a man referred to as the Maestro. His sex appeal almost jumped off the page, leaving her breathless. In the end, she had decided to attend a meeting. The moment she'd made the decision, she was rewarded with a rush of adrenaline, which had left her giddy. After all, she would be entering a world filled with shadows and secrets. It was a world purposely hidden from the public and shunned by most of cultured society. The thought of moving so far from the norm was exhilarating to someone who had lived a sheltered life. Now, even though she was naked under the sheer fabric of her initiation gown, while a group of society members looked on, she was barely aware of any sense of impropriety. The drugs were working their magic. She felt weightless as a leaf bobbing along with the current of a river. She was aware of him, though, the Maestro. He was there, and he was close. His musky aftershave intoxicated her, and the anticipation of his touch was overpowering. She didn't care if she lived or died. There was no reality anymore, only a peaceful haze of recognition. She was about to be initiated into an exclusive club. She would become one with the maestro and enter a world previously anathema to her. She felt a movement next to her. He was there. As he pressed against her, a cool breeze raised goosebumps along her arms and legs, and her nipples grew hard. Her breath came in short, spasmodic gasps. His hand skimmed across her breast as he reached for her chin, and her skin reacted with small electrical pulses that scattered down her midriff and into her groin. Her body was on fire, and she moaned with anticipated pleasure. Something cold flicked against her neck, the essence device. It was the one thing she feared, but the image was lost in the shadows of her mind. He placed the device onto her neck and settled his teeth into the prongs. She felt the sharp tips prick the flesh, causing short spasms of pain as it opened the vein. It should have hurt, but it didn't. Not really. The pain was too fleeting. It registered dimly in the cortex of her brain as if that part of her body had gone to sleep. As he brought her into a tight embrace and began to draw her blood into his mouth, the last thing she felt was his hand drifting beneath the hem of her gown and up her leg.
Wow.
Welcome
What
to
a
the world
great
of
place to
vampires.
start. What a great place
Whoa.
to start a story.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Wow.
you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lynn Bohart, for joining us for a novel talk. Can you tell us, Lynn, anything about what's next that readers can look forward to?
Well, I thought you'd never ask. um, I'm just finishing up the fifth book in the Old Maids of Mercer Island series, and it's called The Key to Murder. And I have to admit, I'm enormously excited about this because it's framed within the mystery of who Jack the Ripper is or was. And you write cozies, and you know that typically they follow a certain pattern of no graphic details or bad language, but mine involve a group of older women who do use some bad language, and they talk about sex, and they somehow get themselves into some pretty nasty situation. And this one is no exception. The difference with this series, though, is, and I have a very loyal fan base for this, is that these books are humorous. People have told me they laugh out loud at some of the antics between Julia Applegate, who's the main character, her four best friends, her dogs, Mickey and Minnie, a talking parrot who quotes old cop movies at just the wrong time, and of course, a friendly ghost or two. So I hope to have this one out by probably the end of January. I've got the cover designed. It's the whole first draft is done. Now it's got to go through beta readers and my editor, and then it'll be out there.
All right. Well, that's exciting. That's very exciting. And listeners, you will want to check out the website lynnbohart-author.com for more information about this author and her books. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And remember, a novel read leads to a novel talk.